Imagine looking out at the universe, just staring up at the night sky and realizing that every single atom, every drop of rain, every human interaction, it isn't just some random collision of matter. It is a system governed by the exact same flawless mathematical scale.
Right, a totally unified system.
Exactly. And if you've ever looked at ancient texts and just dismissed them as fables, stories about magical gardens and talking snakes and stuff, today's source material is going to completely shatter that assumption for you.
Yeah.
We are jumping into a deep dive on a 1,400-year-old text that claims the universe is an intricate, perfectly calibrated machine, and honestly, it demands we observe it as such.
It really is a profound paradigm shift. What we are doing today is looking at an exegesis, basically a deep critical interpretation from the Tolu Islam Digital Archive. Specifically, we are unpacking Lecture 2 out of 4, which focuses on Surah Al-Hijr.
And the whole goal here is to just entirely demystify the story of creation.
Yeah, exactly. The mission of this specific commentary is to strip away centuries of mythological baggage. It replaces all that magic with a framework that sounds shockingly close to modern evolutionary psychology and what we might even call social physics.
Social physics. I love that term. And that is absolutely the mission for today's deep dive. We are taking the creation narrative out of the realm of magic, and we're just dropping it straight into the realm of empiricism.
Which is where the text argues it belongs.
Right. But, to understand the psychology and the evolution of humanity that this text proposes, we have to start with the physical stage we are standing on. We have to look at the Earth itself, and more importantly, how human beings have historically gotten the Earth completely wrong.
The historical context here is crucial, honestly, because the text is actively fighting against an era dominated by pure superstition. I mean, think about the dominant mindset for centuries.
People were literally looking at stars to guess who to marry.
Exactly. People looked up at the stars, not to understand orbital mechanics, but to read their horoscopes. They were consulting astrologers and fortune tellers, operating on this magical thinking that celestial bodies somehow dictated whether a king would win a war or if a farmer would have a good harvest.
Yeah, and even when we tried to get quote-unquote scientific about it in the West, we were so blinded by our own arrogance. I mean, the church in Europe enforced this geocentric worldview, the idea that the Earth was the absolute immovable center of the universe.
Which, you have to remember, was driven entirely by theology, not observation. The underlying assumption was very anthropocentric. Like, if humanity is the crown jewel of creation, then God must have placed us exactly in the center of the room.
Right, everything has to revolve around us. We're the main characters.
Exactly. So when astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo finally built telescopes and observed the actual empirical movements of the planets, they realized, wait, we are just a rock orbiting a sun. And they were severely punished for it.
Because that empirical truth threatened a really fragile theological narrative.
Precisely. But the author of this exegesis points out something staggering here. Long before the telescope, long before Galileo was put under house arrest, the Quran was pushing a heliocentric empirical view.
Yeah, it accurately described the Earth as a rotating sphere that carries us through space, even though it appears spread out to anyone walking on its surface, which is wild for the time period.
It was actively trying to kill magical thinking. It essentially told humanity, look, stop looking at the stars to guess your future and start looking at the dirt under your feet to understand the laws of physics.
I love that. Look at the dirt. And that brings us to the linchpin of this entire philosophy, right? Surah 15, verse 19.
Yes, verse 19. It states, we cause to grow in it everything in due proportion.
Okay, due proportion. Let's dig into that.
The Arabic word used here for due proportion is Mawzoon. And the exegesis spends a lot of time on this word because it doesn't mean a vague poetic sense of harmony. It translates to a highly specific mathematical, chemical, and biological balance.
I really want to pause on this because it feels like a massive leap to make. You're saying this ancient text isn't just offering a nice poetic sentiment like, oh, look at the pretty trees God made.
Not at all.
It's essentially laying down the foundational premise of chemistry.
That is exactly what the author is arguing. To understand Mawzoon, think about a single grain of wheat. The exegesis points out that wheat isn't just wheat by magic.
Right, it's not a magical concept.
Right, it is composed of highly specific percentages of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and other elements. If you alter those fundamental chemical proportions even slightly, the resulting compound is literally no longer wheat.
Oh, wow.
It might be a different plant entirely, or might be toxic, but it loses its essential properties.
So it's like a baker's recipe. If the chemical ratio of baking soda to flour is off by a fraction of a percent, the cake doesn't just taste a little funny. The whole structural integrity collapses.
Yeah, the chemical reaction fails.
And that unyielding mathematical reality, that specific ratio, is the Mawzoon.
Precisely. The properties of any physical object are intrinsically tied to its chemical composition. By focusing on Mawzoon, the text was urging early readers to realize that the physical world operates on fixed, observable, unchangeable laws.
It was a massive push toward the scientific method.
Absolutely. It's saying, if you want to grow more wheat, don't pray to a rain deity. Study the soil composition. Study the Mawzoon.
The author actually uses a really grounded example of this in the text. They describe a farmer encountering a new hybrid variety of wheat, something genetically modified to grow faster.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
Right, so the farmer looks at it and it visually resembles wheat. It fills the stomach. But the farmer notices it doesn't provide the same sustained energy, or it lacks certain nutritional properties of the heritage grain.
Because the balance is off?
Exactly. Why does it lack those properties? Because the internal chemical proportion, that microscopic Mawzoon, has been fundamentally altered.
It is a brilliant way to illustrate that nature's laws cannot be cheated. And what's fascinating is how this concept of perfect calculated balance scales up. I mean, if the chemistry of a single grain of wheat is governed by this uncompromising mathematical precision, it stands to reason that the planetary system supporting that wheat must be equally precise.
Which takes us from the microscopic chemistry of a seed directly into planetary ecology. The text uses the water cycle as the ultimate proof of this scaled-up Mawzoon. And the way the author breaks this down is just, it's beautiful.
It really is.
It treats the Earth like a giant automated desalination and irrigation machine.
Yeah, the exegesis describes the sun acting as a massive thermal engine on the oceans. So the heat distills the heavy, unpalatable salty water. It strips the salt away and elevates pure, life-giving water vapor into the atmosphere.
And then it uses the winds. The text highlights how atmospheric currents act as planetary cargo ships, carrying this distilled vapor across continents.
Dropping it exactly where it's needed.
Yes, it precipitates exactly where the ecology demands it, but my absolute favorite detail is how the text views mountains. It calls mountain peaks nature's water tanks.
That imagery is so striking.
Yeah.
Because it highlights the temporal balance of the system. The mountains catch the precipitation as snow, right? Holding it in a frozen state during the winter when agriculture is just dormant anyway.
Right, when the plants don't even need it yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, precisely when the summer heat arrives and the valleys actually need irrigation for crops, the snow melts and feeds the river systems. It is an extraordinary feat of thermodynamics, meteorology, and fluid dynamics, all working in flawless tandem.
Not a single drop of water is truly lost in the closed loop of the Earth. It simply changes state to serve a function.
Exactly.
Okay, I am completely with you on the physical ecology. It's undeniable. But the author of this exegesis doesn't stop at physical ecology, do they? They take this concept of the water cycle and make a massive, frankly, controversial pivot.
Yeah, they really do.
They apply it to human economics. They introduce this idea based on verses 20 and 21, which we could call social physics.
Yes, and this is where the text transforms from a scientific observation into a searing socioeconomic critique. It is important to know, we're unpacking the sources argument here, but the argument is that just as there are unbreakable physical laws governing rain and soil, there are intended laws governing human society.
Okay, so what are those laws?
Well, verses 20 and 21 state that the earth produces sufficient sustenance, which is referred to as ma'ish for all living creatures. The divine system is described as possessing infinite treasures, but it releases them in a measured, balanced way.
Now, let me push back on that a bit for the listener. Infinite treasures and sufficient sustenance. That sounds incredibly utopian. I mean, we look at the world today, or at really any point in recorded history, and scarcity is the defining feature of human existence.
Sure.
People starve. Supply chains collapse. How does the text reconcile the claim of absolute abundance with the reality of poverty?
It reconciles it by pointing the finger directly at human interference.
Oh.
Yeah. The exegesis argues that poverty and artificial scarcity are not natural phenomena. They are the direct result of humans breaking the Mawzoon of social physics. The text presents a harsh critique of systems that encourage hoarding, what we might recognize today as unchecked, exploitative capitalism.
So it essentially argues that the planet's warehouse is perfectly stocked, but the managers of the warehouse are corrupt.
That is a perfect analogy. The author notes that in a human-made, unbalanced system, a specific class of people presses forward. They use power, leverage, or exploitation to hoard wealth and resources far beyond their actual needs.
Right.
And as an unavoidable mathematical consequence of that hoarding, the rest of the population lags behind, suffering from artificial deprivation.
It's like a dam on a river. Think about the modern supply chain, right?
Right.
The water cycle is doing its job, providing enough water for the whole valley. But if one landowner builds a massive dam upstream to create a private lake, the farmers downstream experience a devastating drought. The drought isn't an act of nature. It's a consequence of hoarding. And the text is arguing that economic disparity works the exact same way. It's an artificial damming of the ma'ish, the sustenance. Again, we aren't taking a political stance here, but the source is very explicit about this.
And the text views this not just as unfair, but as a literal violation of the universe's fundamental laws. The ultimate goal of this divine social physics is to establish an equitable baseline, a society where everyone's basic needs are met without systemic exploitation.
Wow.
When humans normalize hoarding, we aren't just adopting a flawed economic policy. We are fundamentally at war with the cosmic balance. The exegesis implies that any society built on such massive disparities will eventually collapse under the weight of its own imbalance. It's unsustainable by definition.
That is a heavy, heavy realization. It completely reframes how we look at civilization, but it also raises a massive question. Well, if the Earth is this perfectly calibrated system of physical ecology and social physics, how did we get here? How did a biological creature emerge from the system with the capacity to build dams, hoard wealth, and break the rules?
Right.
This brings us to what I think is the most mind-bending part of the entire lecture, the linguistic deep dive into human evolution.
This section is where the rationalist approach of the Tolu Islam archive truly shines. It takes the traditional creation story, the one most of us learned in childhood, and completely deconstructs it.
Right, the Sunday school version. The idea of God acting like a literal cosmic potter, molding a statue out of wet clay, breathing into its nostrils, and then putting it to sleep to surgically extract a rib to make the first woman. The author aggressively rejects this literal mythological reading, don't they?
They do. Because reading it literally contradicts the very empiricism the text has been arguing for up to this point. Instead, the exegesis zeroes in on verse 26, which states that human life originated from Hamayin Maznoon.
Okay, let's unpack that etymology. What exactly does Hamayin Maznoon mean?
Linguistically, it translates to something akin to dark, altered, foul-smelling mud, or a stagnant, rotting clay.
That is, not a very majestic origin story. Foul-smelling mud doesn't exactly inspire poetry.
No, it doesn't, but it perfectly aligns with the scientific consensus on abiogenesis.
The origin of life.
Right, the text is describing the primordial soup. It is pointing to the scientific reality that life began in ancient, stagnant swamps where inorganic matter mixed with water and was subjected to heat and chemical alteration over vast epochs of time.
Wow.
The foul-smelling mud is the birthplace of single-celled bacteria. It is the literal chemical dawn of biology.
Okay, my mind is slightly blown, but let's keep going. Because the text then tackles the most famous debate in theological history, the clay versus the fire. Traditionally, you have humans made of clay, and you have these other entities, the jinn made of smokeless fire.
Right.
Pop culture turned jinn into magical genies granting wishes in lamps or invisible spirits haunting houses. But the author says that's complete nonsense.
Total nonsense. The author traces the Arabic root of the word jinn, which simply means something hidden from sight. It refers to that which is concealed.
Wait, if jinn just means hidden, how does the author connect that to smokeless fire in the context of the Earth's history?
By looking at planetary evolution. Before the Earth cooled enough to have swamps and foul-smelling mud, the clay, it was a blazing ball of magma and volcanic activity.
Oh my God.
The exegesis theorizes that jinn refers to the extinct, intense evolutionary epochs of the Earth's fiery past, and potentially the extremophile life forms that existed in those extreme temperatures.
So beings of smokeless fire aren't ghosts. They are the literal prehistoric hypervolcanic stages of our planet. And they are hidden from us. They are jinn because they are literally buried miles under the Earth's crust as fossils and geological strata. They are hidden by time and rock.
Exactly. It is a breathtaking harmonization of scripture and paleontology. It forces you to read the text chronologically.
Okay, lay it out.
First, the fiery, chaotic, volcanic earth, the jinn. Then the cooling crust and the stagnant primordial swamps producing single-celled organisms, the clay, or Hama in Maznoon. And finally, Over millions of years of evolution, the emergence of the complex biological creature.
And what does the text call that complex creature? It's not just human.
The terms used are ins or bashar. Again, etymology is key here. The root of ims relates to companionship, affection, and socialization.
So the defining leap from mere biology to humanity wasn't just walking upright, it was socialization. It was the ability to cooperate, to form communities, to share resources, which ties perfectly back into the social physics we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
We are fundamentally social creatures engineered to maintain the balance of the community.
Precisely. We evolved from the mud, surviving the fiery past, to become the socialized being. But biology and socialization alone don't explain how we went from living in caves to splitting the atom. There had to be an intellectual leap. And the exegesis addresses this through one of the most misunderstood allegories in religious history, the event of the sajda, or the prostration.
Okay, let's set the stage for this. In the traditional mythological narrative, God makes this clay statue of the first man, and then commands the angels, depicted as these luminous winged beings in heaven, to physically bow down to the statue. It's framed like a royal court, an initiation ceremony.
Which, again, the rationalist author of this exegesis rejects as a literal event. In this framework, angels are not winged humanoids playing harps. The word used for angels, malaika, represents the fundamental forces and unyielding laws of nature.
Wait, really?
Gravity, electromagnetism, thermodynamics, the strong and weak nuclear forces.
So the laws of physics are the angels?
Yes. They are the executors of the divine will in the physical universe. They are the forces that maintain the Mawzoon, the balance. Now look at the human being. The text states that humanity was given divine energy, but it defines this energy very specifically. It is not a magical soul glowing in the chest. It is intellect. It is free will, the capacity for abstract reasoning, and the unique ability to master knowledge and codify it. The text calls this mastery al-kalab, the written law or the compilation of knowledge.
So you have the forces of nature, which operate on strict, unthinking obedience. Gravity doesn't choose to pull things down, it just does.
Exactly.
And then you have this newly evolved creature, the ins, who has the intellectual capacity to observe gravity, measure it, write down its mathematical formula, and eventually use that formula to build an airplane that defies it.
And that realization is the sajda. The prostration of the angels isn't a physical bowing in a mythic garden. It is an ongoing empirical reality. It means that the fundamental forces of nature are designed to be subservient to human intellect. When humanity utilizes reason and masters al-kitab, the codified knowledge of the universe, the laws of physics yield to us.
The implications of that are staggering. It means that every time a scientist cures a disease, every time an engineer builds a bridge that withstands an earthquake, every time we harness solar energy, we are literally watching the angels, the forces of nature, bow to human intellect. It's not magic, it's applied physics.
It is incredibly empowering, but it is also terrifying, because it places the entire burden of civilization's progress and survival squarely on human shoulders.
Right, because we're the ones in control.
Nature will bow to us, but only if we use our intellect correctly. Gravity will help us fly, but if our math is wrong, if we ignore the Mawzoon, gravity will unapologetically crash the plane into the ground. The forces of nature do not have mercy. They only have rules.
The responsibility is immense. We aren't just passive actors on Earth. We are the engine of reason. Nature bows to us, but only if we use our intellect. But, and this is a big but, if the forces of nature submitted to human intellect, there's one force in the story that famously, catastrophically refused. And the way the author interprets this refusal is the psychological climax of the text. It brings us to the entity known as Iblis.
In the traditional narrative, Iblis, often translated as Satan, or the devil, is an external boogeyman. A fallen angel or an arrogant jinn with horns who whispers evil into people's ears. But the Tolui Islam exegesis takes a scalpel to this idea, performing a profound psychological reinterpretation.
I want to slow down here because this genuinely changed how I view human behavior. The author starts by looking at the root of the word Iblis, which comes from balasa. What does that actually mean?
Balasa means to despair, to become intensely frustrated, to lose all hope and succumb to bitter, destructive pessimism.
Hold on. So in this reading, the ultimate villain of human history, the quote-unquote devil, isn't an external monster. It's an internal emotional state. It's the psychology of despair.
Yes. Iblis represents the rebellious, aggressive, entirely emotional and despairing elements within our own human psychology. Remember how we discussed the jinn and the ins? The fiery, chaotic past versus the rational, socialized present? The text argues that these are two sides of our own internal makeup. The Iblis psychology is the fiery, emotional brain hijacking the logical, rational brain.
This makes so much sense of the dialogue in the text. When commanded to submit to human intellect, Iblis famously refuses and says, "I am made of fire and he is made of clay." Traditionally, that's just seen as a demon being proud. But in this psychological framework, it's the anatomy of prejudice.
It is the ultimate manifestation of false logic, which the text refers to as chias. Chias is when you make a deduction based on a flawed premise. The Iblis mindset says, I am inherently better because of my origin, my fire, rather than my intellect or my actions.
I am made of fire, he is of clay. That is the exact justification for racism. It's the justification for nationalism, for class warfare, for any system that judges a human being by their biological or geographical origin rather than their character or intellect. It is arrogance overriding reason.
And because it is rooted in despair and frustration, it is incredibly destructive. The emotional brain refuses to submit to the equitable, rational laws of the social human. And this is where the text gets chillingly relevant to modern life.
How so?
In verses 39 and 40, Iblis makes a promise. Because he cannot physically force humanity to fail, he says he will beautify evil for them on earth.
Okay, let's talk about that. How exactly does one beautify evil? Because nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to be a cartoon villain today. People generally think they are the heroes of their own stories.
That is exactly how the beautification of evil works.
Mm-hmm.
It is the psychological manipulation of our own desires to make destructive, unbalanced systems look attractive, necessary, and even virtuous. It ties directly back to the social physics of hoarding and capitalism we discussed earlier.
Think about it. How do we beautify the hoarding of resources while others starve? We rebrand it. We call relentless exploitative greed hustling or grinding. We look at a billionaire extracting labor from impoverished workers, and we call it maximizing shareholder value or disruptive innovation. We look at explosive, toxic anger, the literal fire of Iblis, and we call it protecting my boundaries or just being aggressively real.
Exactly.
The internal Iblis manipulates our perceptions so thoroughly that breaking the cosmic balance actually feels like a personal victory.
It is the ultimate rationalization of destructive behavior. And the exegesis highlights the defining difference between the rational human mind, represented by Adam, and the emotional, despairing mind, represented by Iblis. The difference comes down to one word: accountability.
Let's look at that contrast, because both Adam and Iblis make a mistake in the narrative. They both slip up, but their reactions are completely opposite.
When Adam, the rational, socialized human, makes an error and disrupts the balance, his immediate response is ownership. He says, I have wronged my own soul. He admits the flaw, analyzes the miscalculation, and seeks to correct his course.
That is the scientific method applied to morality. You make a mistake, you adjust your hypothesis, and you try again.
But when the Iblis psychology makes a mistake,
What happens?
it employs pure escapism. Iblis refuses to look inward. Instead, he points a finger at the divine system itself and says, you led me astray.
Oh, wow.
It is the ultimate victim mentality. The refusal to take responsibility for one's own arrogance is the very core of the Iblis complex. If a society adopts this mindset where no one takes responsibility, where everyone blames the system or blames the other, the clay, that society cannot maintain its Mawzoon. It will fracture.
This text is holding up an incredibly uncomfortable mirror. And honestly, it forces a question that I think you, the listener, need to ask yourself right now. When you mess up in your life, when you break a relationship or fail at a task, do you own it? Do you operate like the rational intellect, acknowledging the miscalculation?
Or does your internal Iblis take over?
Right. Do you point fingers? Are you actively beautifying your own toxic habits because it's easier than submitting to the truth? Is your Iblis keeping you from bowing to reality?
The exegesis does offer a sliver of profound hope regarding this internal battle, though. God responds to Iblis by stating that this psychology of despair will have no power over the sincere servants.
Who are the sincere servants in this framework?
They are the individuals who maintain their alignment with the Mawzoon. They are the people who refuse to let the emotional fire of prejudice overrule their rational intellect. They are the ones who do not hoard, who do not exploit, and who take absolute accountability for their actions. Psychological despair and societal corruption simply cannot defeat a mind that is rigidly committed to truth and balance.
Wow. Okay. We need to take a collective breath because we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by looking at the precise mathematical chemistry of a single grain of wheat, the unyielding Mawzoon.
Right.
We scaled that up to watch the sun and the mountains operate a flawless planetary water cycle. We confronted the uncomfortable reality that human greed and hoarding act as artificial dams, breaking the social physics of our world.
And from there, we dug into the literal dirt of our origins. We saw how the primordial swamp, the foul-smelling, mud-birthed biological life following the fiery volcanic epochs of the planet's hidden past.
We watched that biological life evolve the capacity for reason, forcing the very laws of physics, the angels, to bow to human mastery. And finally, we ended up inside the theater of our own minds, watching the rational intellect battle the fiery, defensive, blame-shifting psychology of our own internal despair. This has been a complete dismantling of mythological thinking.
The true story of creation, as presented here, isn't about magic. It is the epic story of intellect overcoming aggression, both in the natural world and within ourselves.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. If the universe is genuinely built on due measure, on this perfect, unyielding proportion, and human misery only occurs when we artificially break that balance, what is one area of your life right now where you are taking more than your fair share?
That's the real question.
Or, conversely, where are you refusing to take responsibility and blaming the universe for your own fire? What happens when you do that? And more terrifyingly, what happens when an entire civilization decides to live that way?
That is the ultimate question of social physics. What happens when the balance is pushed past the breaking point?
And it's a question we are going to answer. We've seen the struggle within the individual today. In Lecture 3 out of 4, we take this to the civilizational level, exploring the specific fates of the people of Lutz and the people of the Wood in verses 3 through 77 to see exactly what happens when a society's balance is finally irreversibly broken. It is a historical and psychological autopsy you will not want to miss. Until then, keep digging, keep questioning, and above all, keep your balance.